Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome back to the Friendship Quilt Along. I am celebrating because this is block number 13, our last block. And as you can see, it is the scrappiest of the bunch. So let's get started piecing this beautiful Hidden Hearts block together. So here is the center of our block, and I have laid it out, and as you can see, this is a 6 by 6 grid. So there are 6 units across and 6 units up, and that means we're going to piece this together pretty much in rows. So be very careful with your layout. As you can see, there are lots of pieces. We have a lot of these super scrappy hourglass pieces. We've got a lot of 2-color hourglass where we have scrap and background color. So make sure that you have everything laid out properly. Consider taking a picture of this simply because there's just so many scraps. Sometimes it's easy to get something flipped around and turned the wrong way. And as you can see, that's going to change the overall look of the block. So take a picture of it and stare at that picture for a little while just to make sure that you have everything on track. Okay, so now, as you know, we're going to take this and get it on the machine in rows. I want to make sure that I am penning or clipping in a method that is easily repeatable. So I'm going to start over here. I'm going to take that first square, flip it over, place my clip, open it back up, grab the next piece, flip it straight over, right sides together, place a clip. It's really important to have some sort of systematic method so that way you're sure you're not picking up a piece, rotating it, and clipping it in a way that's incorrect. So, if you accidentally took this and went like that, obviously you're going to have a very different look to your block as well. So you want to pick up, flip, and clip. And pins will work great too for this. I just like to grab something really quick so that way I can just grab it, clip it in place. And this is just to hold the pieces together. I'm obviously not taking my time to get those edges in nice alignment or anything like that. I am just simply clipping it long enough that I get it to the machine and things aren't going to fall apart or fall out of the correct order. Okay, so I'm just going to continue one piece at a time, flip it over, give it a clip, and I'll meet you at the sewing machine when we're ready to start piecing these rows together. So here at the machine, now I take the clip away from that ending piece and I make sure that those blocks are in nice alignment. All of the edges are lined up great. And if you have one end or the other that doesn't have seam allowance, I like to flip it, so I'm going through the seam allowance first. In this case, I've got seam allowance on both sides and it's a little bit on the bulky side. So I'm going to hang on to my scrap charger, and as soon as I get my needle into this, I'm going to kind of just pull on it ever so slightly, and that's going to help feed it through the machine. Just those bulky places can be just a little tricky. All right, now I'm going to kind of grab a hold of that and just make sure that those fabrics are still in nice alignment all the way down to the point, to the tip. There we go. Now I'm going to grab the next one. I'm just going to keep these in order and work one seam at a time. So here's a situation where we've got the seam down here. All I'm going to do is take it and flip it over, not changing the layout or the arrangement or anything. I'm just making sure that that area of bulky seam gets stitched first. I kind of put it in jail, so I stitched through that first. So this is how I'm going to piece through all 6 rows. I'm just going to grab one at a time, line up those fabrics, make sure that they're nicely stacked on top of one another all across that edge, and then feed it through the machine. Now, one thing I'm doing, I am lifting up on that foot and my needle is ending up in the down position, lifting up on that foot and pushing the fabrics right up against the needle. Again, that also kind of puts it in jail and it ensures that these pieces are not going to slip out of shape. So just keep that in mind and go one piece at a time, stitch through all of those seams. Chain piecing is so relaxing and so easy. So just keep yourself on track, don't get distracted, and really enjoy putting the center of your block together. So I have all 6 of my rows pieced together, and then now I'm finger pressing open all of these seam allowances. And then I'm going to grab my hot, dry iron and just press those open nicely. And it's really important to take the time to do this. Finger press all of the seams open first, then press with your iron. because if you just try and dig at that seam with the tip of your iron, it's really not going to flatten out very nicely. And it's not going to be as flat and open as it could be. Now watch out for all of these other seams. You can see that one of the holes on my iron kind of caught that and flipped it over. You can put your iron over the entire thing and flatten it back out again. So just watch out for that. Once I get the seams pretty much where I want them to go, it's good to flip it over on your pressing board like this. Make sure everything is nice and flat, and then give it another press. And that's just, hold the iron down. Don't wiggle it. I have that bad habit of wiggling the iron around, and it really doesn't help. So just try and set it in place and just let that heat do its job. I sometimes like to press my hand over it too, so that way it really soaks in. And that just flattens out those seams so nicely, and that's going to help the block lay flatter. There's so many seams and little tiny pieces in this block, and if they are really flipped up, if they're really bulky, it's going to just make quilting over this much more challenging. So just take your time. I know this is just one of those little persnickety kind of things, but it's one of those things that's definitely worth taking a little bit of time to make sure that all those seams are pressed nice and flat. And work just one at a time, so that way you don't get confused which row is which. And again, refer back to the photograph you took when you had all of the pieces laid out, so that way you can see how it should be looking, how it should be going together. And so the last thing I want you to do is get to this stage and then start piecing things backwards and then having to rip things out. So here's a great example of this. Obviously, this is flipped around because we're kind of aiming to have this nice shape here in those corners. So all I need to do is rotate that around and I'm back on track. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to pin these two rows together. I already have them prepped up. I'm going to set these aside so I can press them nice and flat too. So these two rows are ready to piece together. I'm going to take one and flip it on top of the other so they're right sides together. And then I'm going to work to match up these seams. And pretty much every single seam on this piece needs to match up nicely. That doesn't mean we necessarily have to pin every single one, but that is what we're aiming to have all of those seam lines match up nicely. So here's a few tips. First thing I do is I make sure that the outside edges are lined up well, and I pull back, and I know this is black on in some of these cases. That's hard to see. So just pull back on that, make sure that those seam lines are stacked up nicely. And sometimes this is just a little bit bulky because of seam allowance from these hourglass or half square triangles. So sometimes I will even pull back on that seam allowance and just pin through the unit, not through all those layers of seam allowance too. So something like that. When I'm at the machine, I just need to make sure that that flips over and it's going in the right direction so that seam is nice and flat. So that's something, when you're pinning through, in some cases, we've got the seam here from the hourglass block. We've got extra seam allowance from the back of that. So that's 2 layers of fabric. On the other side, I only have the one, so that's 3 layers of fabric, maybe 4 in certain cases. And that can be just a little bit on the bulky side, and that can result in your seam slipping a bit. Again, this goes back to fabric and how we prepared our fabric to start with. All of these fabrics feel nice and stiff and stable, and I can feel that in my hand as I'm penning, so I'm not too worried. So long as this is getting started on the right foot and I begin this seam, stitching accurately and nothing slips out of shape, then I think it's going to be a-okay. And you're going to, as you go through the blocks and stitch as much as you have so far, you might find that you don't need a pin as much. You can trust the prep, the fabric prep that you did. You can trust the seam allowances that you already stitched on these units, and it's really entirely up to you if you want to pin every single seam or just a few of those. Okay, so these pieces are ready to go. We're ready to piece them together. Let's take it to the machine and stitch down this line. So here at the machine, I'm just making sure that those edges, those corners are in nice alignment in both directions, up here and on this side. And one thing I've done is I've taken my Supreme slider and I've slid it up here, and I'm covered basically there's like a little lip here right before my bobbin case, and I was noticing that some of my seams were hitting that and flipping back the wrong way. So by putting this is a queen size Supreme slider here, it's a slippery Teflon sheet, and covering that up, I can basically just slide my pieces in. It feels so much smoother, and get started. And I don't think that they're gonna flip and have that tendency to flip to one direction or the other, because that's there. But it's always good to check. So here I'm just flipping that over and just making sure that seam allowance is pointing in the right direction. And then once I make sure it's right, I just use fingertip pressure there to make sure it stays on track. And take out those pins as you reach them. Try not to hit them if you can avoid it. It really does dull your needle when you hit, and hit a pin just exactly right. And if you hit it just exactly wrong, you could actually break your needle. So watch out for that. Again, flipping up, making sure those seams are in nice alignment. I'm going to take that needle out just a little bit earlier. Let's see how that goes. And looks like that seam was just flipping over just a bit, so I'm going to adjust my pen here. Notice how much time that I take. This is something that I really think requires patience. It's not something to rush. I'm just going to go in and take that pen out completely and flip those back the right way. It's never something to rush. Piecing is so relaxing. I was just recently talking to someone, and she was like, I work a high-powered job. It's very stressful. And then I just make myself come home and use my sewing machine for 15 minutes every day after work. And it's kind of like that just helps her relax. And see, oops, there, I just hit that pin. As you can see, it won't break your machine instantly, but it's still not all that good. But I really like that idea, just having those 15 minutes just to decompress from work and, take your time, enjoy it, enjoy every second of it. Okay, we got one more here, just making sure I'm feeling with the tips of my fingers, I can oftentimes feel when the seam allowance is doing something funky. So that's another thing that you can kind of add in as you're learning piecing, as you're getting the hang of it. Just start, as you feel something, kind of check in on it. Hey, that feels like that's right. That feels like nothing's flipping over the wrong way. And grab another scrap charger and stitch through it so our machine stays in stitching mode. Again, I'm using my firm pressing board and just finger pressing the seam allowance open nicely all the way down. And then really want to make sure that these seams get pressed flat. That's going to be really the bulkiest, is especially where we have, you see that seam allowance coming in, seam allowance coming in there. It's all coming together in the same points, but the longer that you press with a nice hot dry iron, the flatter everything's going to become. So you're going to have areas that are a little bit higher and a little bit lower than others. And this is something that's important to keep in mind whenever you flip your block over and start pressing from the right side. These higher and lower areas can hit your iron. Those higher spots can hit your iron really hard, and you can start to kind of singe the fabric. That ends up showing up as slightly shiny. To stop that from happening, grab a little square or scrap of extra fabric and just use that as a pressing cloth between your block and your iron. Just slide that down. It also helps, it really helps to trap the heat in and help flatten out those units too. So really the pressing cloth is a good thing to get in the habit of using all the time whenever working on any patchwork. And even for garment sewing too, a pressing cloth is really nice. If you've got some gunk on the bottom of your iron, that stops it from getting off on your block too. So there we go. All right, so there's 2 rows put together, nice matching seams. I'm going to continue this exact same thing. I'm going to press all of these strips and then piece them together. And here's what it looked like whenever I finished the center of this block. So now let's work on our border, and we're going to do 2 different little mini blocks for this area. We're going to do a cute little patchwork heart and a square and a square. So to make the heart, first you're going to piece some hourglass units with only 1 black triangle. So make sure to watch the other tutorial on piecing hourglasses. You'll also need 2 half scrappy, half background or black, half square triangles. So also watch the video on that too. Okay, just piece those units together in sets of 2, then piece those together. That makes your heart shape. And here we go. That's what it looks like when you get it pieced together. Your corner square and a squares are super easy. This is just 4 half square triangles. Piece it together the same way in sets of 2, and that's going to be your corner block. Okay, so now I'm going to grab the block and lay out my border. So the first thing you'll want to do is piece together 3 sets of hearts, and that's going to go to the top and bottom edges of your block. Just piece those together, press those seam allowances open, and piece them to the top and bottom. And they should match seams through each point, but as you can see, as it goes super scrappy, it's not going to be really noticeable if those seams get a little bit off. That's okay. And then on the sides, you're going to piece together another 3 hearts and then put your square and a square on both sides. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Just piece those 3 hearts together, have the square and the square in the corners, and here's what's going to look like when we finish this block. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed piecing this hidden hearts block with me and all of the other blocks that we've made together this year. If you'd like to join in the fun and make a super scrappy happy friendship quilt, come and check out all of the patterns and all of the tutorials I've shared at leahday.com/friendship. Until next time, let's go quilt.